Would you believe me if I told you a large retailer spent $100 million on its SAP implementation and it resulted in a massive failure? Stay tuned to this video to find out more. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world reach the third stage of digital transformation success. Many of those implementations involve SAP S/4HANA implementations. And a company called Spar Group, who is not a client of Third Stage Consulting's, is a food retailer based out of South Africa. They manufacture and distribute food. They have some retail outlets as well. They're about an $8 billion company. They recently spent over $100 million on their SAP S/4HANA implementation, and it resulted in a massive failure. Now, the good news is it didn't have to be this way. There's a lot of good lessons we can take away from this implementation, and we're going to dive into that here in today's video. So let's start with an overview of the SAP failure at Spar Group. As I mentioned, Spar Group is an $8 billion company. They do about $8 billion in annual turnover or revenue. They have retail operations, distribution operations, and some manufacturing facilities throughout the world based out of South Africa. And anytime a company like that, who's publicly traded, puts out a financial report and they mention their ERP project in the financial report, it's usually not a good sign. In January of 2025, the company published its financial results for the fiscal year 2024. And in that financial statement, they outlined a number of problems they had with their SAP implementation. First of all, they spent close to $100 million on the implementation, which is a staggering amount for any size company, even an $8 billion company. But what's even more alarming and shocking is that the company lost over $100 million in sales that it directly attributed to its SAP project. So in theory, the project cost not just $100 million, but $200 million in counting. In addition to the problems they had with lost sales, they also have had problems tracking their margins. They haven't been able to track their margins and optimize their margins, which, if you're familiar with the food and the retail industry, margins are very slim. So every tiny little bit of margin that you can get is a big deal. So for a company not be able to manage their important financial controls and the margins behind it, that's a big deal. The other issue that they had is they found that the warehouse management system of SAP didn't fill their needs. And they ended up having to scrap the WMS, or the warehouse management system, and revert to a third-party warehouse management system. So not only was the SAP implementation a disaster, but they had to diversify outside of SAP, which isn't a bad thing, but they found out the expensive and the hard way. And to add insult to injury, the SAP implementation had resulted in a lot of manual processes and actually increased their labor costs. And for those of you thinking about going through an SAP implementation, I'm going to speculate that you're probably doing the SAP implementation in the hopes or the expectation that you'll reduce your manual processes and reduce your labor costs, but that was not the case here with the Spar Group. So that raises the question, what can we take away from this? What lessons are there to be learned? And the good news is that there are some good lessons here, and it's not rocket science. So the things I'll share today are not super complicated. It may sound like common sense as I go through these things, but as we'll discuss, and as we've seen in this failure and other failures that we've studied, a lot of organizations and project teams make decisions that don't make a lot of sense at the time, but it's human behavior and organizational behavior that oftentimes leads to some of these decisions. So we'll talk about what those decisions and strategies are that undermine the project and talk about the things you could do to make your S/4HANA implementation more successful. Now, if you're looking for more best practices to guide you through your S/4HANA implementation, I want to share with you a book that we wrote that outlines some of the lessons we have from helping so many clients through their implementations, including some clients that had failed the first time around in their S/4HANA implementation and hired us to come help fix the project. So we share a lot of these lessons with you in our guide to successful S/4HANA implementations. You can download this guide for free by scanning the QR code right here. It'll give you a lot of best practices and tips to make sure that your S/4HANA project is successful. So scan the QR code here, or you can go to the links below. In addition, you may also want to check out our Journey to S/4HANA podcast series. It's a podcast that we started in 2024, and it features a number of industry best practices and experts and thought leaders to really help you learn from others on what it takes to make an S/4HANA implementation successful. You can listen to or watch that podcast by going to journey2s4hana.com. When we look at the problems and evaluate the issues that Spar Group had in their implementation, it's clear that they didn't spend an adequate amount of time on their current state business processes. Because if they had focused on and understood their current state business processes adequately, they wouldn't have run into the problems they had. Most notably, the fact that they couldn't manage their margins and they couldn't get visibility into what their margins really were, whereas in their old legacy system they could. That tells you that there's a disconnect between the competencies and the processes and the workflows they had built up over time and the actual S/4HANA implementation. Now, it's easy to say, well, we don't care about our current state because we want to move to a new technology and we want to adapt to new business processes. That's great. S/4HANA can bring new capabilities to you, but there's probably a lot of things you're doing really well, and there's a reason you're doing some of the things you're doing, even if those processes are imperfect or even if they're manual processes or even if they could be improved. You still need to understand what they are so you understand the intent of what it is you need S/4HANA to do for you. For example, when you look at the warehouse management system and how that warehouse system didn't work for the company and they ended up having to abandon SAP's warehouse management module, it was pretty clear that if they knew what the business processes were in their current state and what they expected to maintain and preserve in those current state processes, they would have known, or they should have known, that the SAP warehouse management system wasn't going to work for them. Same with the pricing analysis and the margin analysis that was so important to the company. The fact that they didn't understand that and bake that into the future state tells you that they either didn't understand their current state or they didn't adequately take that into consideration when they're designing the new system. So just because you're designing a new system and you're trying to define a new future state set of business processes doesn't mean you want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and ignore the processes you have today. And as we'll talk about later in this video, without a current state understanding, your change management efforts are going to suffer as well. In addition to clearly understanding your current state and understanding what's working and what you're doing well in your current state, as well as what you're not doing well and what you want to improve in your current state, now you want to transition into fully defining your future state business processes. And you want to do this before you start implementing S/4HANA. It's so common for organizations to say, we bought S/4HANA, we know we're moving to S/4HANA, let's just get the integrators in here and the technical consultants to come in and start designing and building stuff. Well, that's the wrong answer, because what happens is you're going to rush through decisions, or you're going to slow down decisions and it's going to slow down the project and delay it, or your consultants are going to make those decisions for you and they're going to make those decisions in a vacuum without consideration of your strategy and what your needs and priorities are. So any one of those three things will happen if you don't do your future state up front. So that's why it's so important that you slow down before you start the project. A lot of companies want to dive in and just get going and start to speed things up. And they think that by skipping the assessment of future state processes and just jumping right into the technology, they think that's actually going to speed things up. And it does speed things up in the short term. It'll feel like you're making a lot more progress than you would otherwise. But what it's going to do inevitably is going to slow things down later in the future. And it's going to create a lot more headwinds and problems and misalignments and mismatches between business processes and technologies. And that's the sort of stuff that derails these projects. That's the sort of stuff that causes budgets to get out of control. And that's the sort of stuff that leads to the problems that Spar Group experienced here, which is not having a clear future state and not having a technology being delivered that addresses those future state business processes and requirements. The other thing that's important with clearly defining future state is that it allows you to create a very clear testing strategy, user acceptance testing. And by doing thorough user acceptance testing with your clearly defined future state processes, you should be exposing these sorts of issues that Spar Group had. So for example, when we look at these pricing and margin issues that they experienced, if they had clearly defined future state business processes and they had user acceptance testing scripts that match up to those future state processes, they would have caught this problem before they ever went live with S/4HANA. They didn't catch those problems, so that tells me they probably didn't factor in those future state business processes into their test strategies for the system before they went live. So it's really important that you not only define the future state business processes, but you use those future state processes for user acceptance testing as well as training too. You want to clearly communicate to people and train people on what these new processes look like, and you can't do that unless you have the future state well defined. And I'm going to come back to this whole change management adoption issue here later in the video. When we think of SAP adoption and change management, more often than not, system integrators and SAP as a company and SAP consultants that are out there think of adoption as training. They think about just training people on how to use the new system, communicate to people how to use the new system. But really, this is a digital transformation. This isn't about SAP. It's not about S/4HANA. It's about your business and your processes. And SAP just happens to be the provider of technology that enables some of those business processes. So it's really important that we look at the people side of the equation, because we can't enable these new business processes without the people side of the equation being addressed. And the technology becomes worthless if people aren't using the system. And I would argue that no matter how much Spar Group had invested in change management, they were probably still going to fail if they hadn't addressed the other things I talk about earlier in this video. But change management is a way to draw out some of the issues and challenges and kinks in the processes and the technologies that are being deployed. I talked earlier about user acceptance testing and how important it is to base your user acceptance test scripts on your future state business processes that should be well documented. And by involving more people in that user acceptance testing from the business and following those future state business processes as part of their scripts for testing, that usually draws out issues and problems that inevitably happen as part of the design and the build of technology. Now, if Spar Group had invested in change management, that would have been another stopgap or a guardrail to catch some of these problems that they had. So the fact that they didn't catch these problems tells me they probably didn't invest super heavily or effectively in organizational change management. So it's really important to make sure that you invest heavily in change management. You invest in well beyond just training and communications that SAP or their system integrators might provide to you. There's a lot more that needs to happen starting on day one of your implementation, even in the phase 0 implementation planning phase. If you'd like to learn more about what you should be doing in that upfront phase of change management planning and the phase 0 piece of it, I encourage you to read our Guide to SAP Implementations. It's a guide that covers a number of best practices around how to make S/4HANA implementation successful based on us helping clients through so many of their implementations. You can read that guide by scanning this QR code right here or go to the links below. When SAP and their system integrator comes to you to talk about your S/4HANA upgrade, there's nothing they would love more than for you to say, I'm going all in on SAP and SAP's stack of technology. I'm going to deploy S/4HANA. I'm going to deploy some of the advanced tools like Ariba, Concur, SuccessFactors, Business Objects, a lot of other systems that SAP owns. And the reality is SAP and S/4HANA and some of the sister products that they have are not necessarily going to be the best fit for you. And that's something that Spar Group learned the hard way, especially with their warehouse management system. For a food distribution company where margins and efficiency are so important, and especially at scale for a large $8 billion company, warehouse management is a critical function of their operations and their supply chain. And if S/4HANA's warehouse management system can't handle those needs, then it's okay to go out and find a third-party bolt-on that you can integrate with S/4HANA. Now, SAP may tell you it's a bad idea, or the system integrator that's aligned with SAP might tell you that's a bad idea, but it's your business and you've got to find the technology that works best for you. And it's not just warehouse management, it's other functions and departments and workflows within your business that you want to make sure are aligned with what SAP can and can't do. And inevitably, you're going to find gaps in S/4HANA. You're going to find that there's certain things that it doesn't do well or it doesn't do the way you want it to or you need it to. And that's okay. But you need to identify that stuff up front before you ever start the implementation so you can figure out a deliberate strategy of how to address that. Because you may decide you want a third-party bolt-on. You may decide you want to customize the software. You may decide that you want to change your business processes to fit the software, and you're okay with that. But whatever the case is, depending on the business process and the areas of gaps between the current state processes and what SAP can do, you want to make sure you have a deliberate strategy for how to address that. And you want to make sure that you've factored those risks and those activities into your implementation plan and budget because those have a material effect on it. Now, it's easy to think you don't want to bring out the bad news or focus on the negative things as it relates to S/4HANA, but every ERP system, every technology is going to have downsides and risks. You just need to understand that up front rather than burying it or ignoring it because it will come out eventually later in the implementation. So I hope this is providing you some guidance and some lessons from this really important case study, this really important failure, one of the more massive failures we've seen in the SAP space in the last few years. Again, if you want to avoid failure, you want to learn more about how to make your SAP project successful, we wrote an independent tech-agnostic guide to successful S/4HANA implementations. It's not sugar-coated. It's just speaking the truth of what we see as independent tech-agnostic consultants. So I encourage you to read our free ebook off our website. It's called Guide to Successful S/4HANA Implementations. You can read it by scanning the QR code or go to the links below. And also be sure to check out our Journey to S/4HANA podcast. Go to journeytosforhana.com. And finally, if you'd like to brainstorm ideas as it relates to your SAP project, if you just want to informally discuss what you're doing and what you might be able to do better, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to have an informal conversation with you and just brainstorm with you on how you might improve some of your strategies and tactics for how you're executing your S/4HANA implementation. I've included my contact information right here, or you can go to the links below. So if you found this information useful, and I hope you have a great day.